I'm Michael Wilner, the Washington Bureau Chief for the Jerusalem Post, and we're really happy to be here today to have this conversation, just generally about what you do, Rabbi, and some of the experiences you've had since the last GA that you went to. Why don't you tell everyone exactly what you do, what the organization is about, and just introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Michael. I'm the president of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is a 70-year-old organization made up of 125 Jewish community relations councils around the country and 16 national organizations, like the ADL and the AJC and National Council of Jewish Women, Hadassah, the four religious movements. So it's like 140 organizations whose major purpose is to try to come up with consensus public policy for the American organized Jewish community. And if you see the broad spectrum, it's not simple, it's not easy, but it's important. The organization was formed actually during World War II, when our community was having a hard time getting its voice heard, when like a ship like the St. Louis was actually here, and our president sent it back to Germany for people to die. The Jewish Federation movement decided they should create a totally independent organization of the Federation movement that could actually pursue these different kinds of issues. The main goals of it are actually to try to both bring people together in consensus and also to pursue justice. Either of those goals are not simple.
Right.
So
right.
that's sort of the story.
And so, how do you? I mean, you went a little bit into it just there, but how do you separate out your organization from what folks in the industry like to call the alphabet soup of organizations? And B'nai B'rith has some specialties. Certainly poverty focused as well. How do you define the organization?
Well, no other organization has as its goal on a full scale of potential American policies to find consensus on all of them. I mean, our job is to find out where this community stands on fighting poverty in America. And we don't speak unless we can bring those 140 organizations into a not unity, but consensus, not unanimity, but something that we can work on together. So we have every year a major plenum where over the year a lot of conversations have taken place. There's resolutions that come before that plenum on a host of subjects. And like last year we passed a $10.10 minimum wage. Or last year we passed a resolution to urge all of our organizations to fight against European anti-Semitism. And you may think, well, it's sort of a no-brainer. Jewish organizations are going to fight against European anti-Semitism. But we kind of bring it to a head and really have everyone talking about it and give a very specific resolution of the kinds of ways we should do it. So it's an important, there's not, the alphabet soup is, many of them are part of our organization, but they don't have an alphabet soup underneath them like we do, as it's a word umbrella for it.
Well, consensus building in the Jewish community must be quite a task. And you listed some things that you did identify as commonalities and things that you could build consensus for, but what are some of the more difficult points of division that you've been struggling with for some time in terms of consensus building?
Two come to mind. One is settlements in the West Bank, and I guess Gaza at one point, but now that's not really an issue, because there are several members of our organizations strongly on one side or the other, and therefore we haven't been able to take a position. It took a while, like probably my third year here, 2007, second year here, that we actually took a position on two states. The other issue that seems to have caused in the last 2 years, a great sort of difficulty in coming to consensus was gay marriage, where we had, some of our one or two of our organizations really had a very difficult time with supporting it. And although our resolutions committee had endorsed it 20-0, because of the problem that one of the organizations had, we were willing to forego that for the time being because we didn't really have that kind of the consensus we like. When somebody very strong is very against us taking a stand at that time, we try to be responsive. Those are probably the only two issues I can think of where there's been that kind of question. Because in all honesty, whether it's poverty in America and climate change legislation, civility, everybody seems okay. Whether it's a comprehensive plan for immigration, fighting, we were overwhelmingly supportive of America going into Syria during the chemical weapons, challenge, or so it's interesting how much consensus and often unanimity there is. You might not think a $10.10 minimum wage would be something that the vast majority of the Jewish community is willing to stand up and say, we're for one.
Right. How do you get metrics on that sort of consensus? You go by the leaders of sort of your membership organizations? And
it's not so much by the leaders. Okay. There's a vote that actually happens every year. It's a conference akin to this one, but it's called the Plenum. And they send representatives. They generally talked together, whether it be the 125 community relations councils. They've argued, they've debated, they've learned a lot.
Right.
Whether it be the ADL or the HAC or the Reform Movement or the Orthodox Union, they've discussed it and they come into the room and they vote. And it's a several hour, like you can come, we'll have a plenum here in October at a hotel in Washington. So if you're around, come, and you'll see it in action. There's a lot of chocolate, and people are up all night.
I will certainly be there, but just in terms of, because this is a topic that came up this year with J Street's bid to join the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. And that became a question of what counts as a Jewish organization by the metrics of certain people. Is that something that you come up against, and was that a moment for you that was concerning, or what were your thoughts on that?
Well, two things. One is we believe very strongly that only through an open table can American Jewry be strong, only through talking to each other and learning what each other has to say. So number one, our natural inclination would be to support J Street's membership. But secondly, we do a lot of work on against BDS in America, against delegitimization. And J Street has been very strongly supportive in much of that work. When we were in front of the Presbyterians, 3 times they've actually come through for us. So we supported their membership, and it wasn't that complicated. And we tend to support openness. So whether you be on the right or the left, we would tend to support you being a part of the Jewish discussion. I mean, there are places, obviously there's places on the right where people say things that, are very hard to understand about the Palestinians, and there's places on the left where people say things about the legitimacy of the state of Israel or the idea of a two-state solution, which also makes it hard for us. But mostly we try to be open, and we urge others to be open.
Right. Now you mentioned that it took quite a while for the two-state solution to become the consensus position in the Jewish community here. Of course, it's not the consensus position in Israel at this point in its politics. How do you view that? Do you view any dissonance there? And do you see the current state of Israeli politics and the positions of some of its politicians on the right having an influence in possibly eroding that consensus here in the U.S.?
I'm concerned that some of the statements that come out that are not that don't seem to be very democratic about how the state's going to treat Arab minorities, how it's going to treat non-Orthodox minorities can have a negative impact, but so far I think that democracy has stood true. There's been challenges, I mean, I could go through some of them, but of course it would. I mean, Americans and Jewish Americans are deeply committed to democracy as a sort of a stable thing. So if Israel were to deviate, it would create problems. I don't think it has. I mean, I think if you look, there's challenges. Somebody says they want X. X doesn't usually happen. In fact, it almost never happens. So it's like we're not going to sell land to non-Jews. Well, it doesn't happen. So yeah, of course it would. I don't think it has, because I think Israel has fundamentally stood. You have bills coming up in our Congress all the time, and they don't pass. So if they don't pass, we're not going to probably. And they don't pass. And there's a very strong Supreme Court in Israel that also has the capacity to weigh in, which it does a lot.
Right. We were also talking about a little bit before we got on stage.
When we had that long meeting.
When we had that long meeting before, just about pluralism and whether the American Jewish community has a role in the debate in Israel regarding pluralism. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the American Jewish community has a role in any debate in Israel. The question of what the role is really what Israelis feel and listen to it. So, I mean, Americans and American Jews particularly are going to speak up about war and peace issues. They're going to speak up about pluralism issues. And, Israelis tend to be responsive, if not, they certainly don't, they're not obeisant, they do what they feel like. So, yeah, I think Americans have the right to speak up, particularly on pluralism issues, because I think it has a lot to do with the notion of how Israel was founded as a democratic state. I don't think they have the right to control, they just have the right to speak up.
Right. And during the Gaza conflict, you mentioned that was another point of lack of consensus, to say the least. Could you tell us a bit about the struggles that you had? Because everything was very tense at the time, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, what were some of the greatest challenges during Operation Protective Edge over the summer?
I think in that particular crisis, all of our organizations tended to be quite understanding and supportive of Israel's actions. There wasn't that much dissent, I don't even think within the American Jewish community, according to polls I've seen, about what Israel did. I mean, yes, people wished that there weren't so many deaths of innocents, but generally when you're facing thousands of rockets and tunnels that go under kibbutzim, people say, yes, you have a right to stand up, and you'll probably make some mistakes along the way. I didn't have the kind of tension coming towards me, from people out there that are part of our orbit, that I did, say, the conflict a few years ago, like 2008, 2009, where people thought there might have been some disproportionate attacks. On the other hand, we do have extensive connections with the mainline churches, and we work with them all the time. And they were much more concerned about the Israelis' use of force in that. But I think we stood our ground pretty well. I didn't see, by the way, just to be honest, Michael, I didn't see a lot of them, a lot of the mainline churches, which are often difficult, criticizing Israel too much, if at all, during that crisis.
Right. Yeah, it's always interesting because the reverberations of that certainly are tremendous. You mentioned finding consensus on European anti-Semitism and pushing back against that. What are your efforts at the UN, if any? And how are they coordinated with other Jewish organizations or whatnot, pro-Israel organizations?
Well, I mean, in general, our efforts at the United Nations are not. We don't have the engagement that, say, American Jewish Committee has, but they're part of us, or B'nai B'rith has. But we do speak up quite a bit. I mean, I'm often in meetings with the ambassador, with Samantha Power, and we talk a lot about what we think should happen. And we, certainly have worked with the administration when they needed to cast a veto several years ago. I mean, I remember having long conversations with people at the NSC about it. So it's not like every day, but I mean, I do think that the United Nations needs to not be engaged with Israel the way they sometimes feel like they will be, because if the nations as a whole don't tend to be very supportive of the Palestinians just generically.
Sure.
So we tend to be in there supposing that.
Right, and it's a particularly pressing question because you've seen pretty extraordinary rhetoric from the administration over the past 3-4 weeks, really since the beginning of October, on settlement activity, which you mentioned obviously lacks consensus in the American Jewish community. But one of the pressing questions is whether there's going to be another bid at the UN. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do those two things conflate, right? You have lack of consensus on within the American Jewish community on settlement activity.
Great question.
Right.
It's a great question. My guess is that the United States will continue to oppose and probably veto any legislation to attack Israel for its settlement activity. That's my guess. I don't put much store in rhetoric because I think rhetoric happens on all sides, and it generally tends to be part of sort of the political game to move people into one direction or another. I mean, I think there's some reality that there's some very strong disappointments by both sides in terms of how the other has spoken out. But I haven't yet seen any real indication that certainly our country, America, is going to abandon Israel in any way. I mean, I think that's, it's foolish to say it, and it just hasn't been true.
And you do think that abstaining from such a vote would be a nuclear option that would be a betrayal?
I would not use the word betrayal, but I think I would use the word, it would not show the kind of loyalty that I think this country has shown over quite a long time. And not always. I mean,
right.
We certainly have deviated, but I would hope that, and I'm sure we will deviate sometime again.
Right.
We're not, and I also don't know exactly what the exact issue, how it will be defined. But my guess will be that we won't deviate, that we'll stand with Israel. I think the president has been with Israel pretty consistently in the United Nations. I haven't seen any diminution of our support. I don't think I will. But
do you think the president's position towards Israel is reflective of the American Jewish community's consensus positions on Israel? Do you think he represents that community well?
Yeah, I think his positions, meaning his support of Israel, is relatively reflective of the American Jewish community's positions. I've never seen a great deal of support on the left at all, in terms of certainly the far left. But I haven't seen a great deal of support as far as supporting United Nations resolutions that are either giving the Palestinians statehood or resolutions that attack Israel for settlements. I just haven't seen that. I think there's a difference between the person saying, I don't like settlements, I don't think they're helpful, and a person saying, I want the United Nations to pass a resolution attacking Israel or supporting a Palestinian state. Those are, you can do both. You can hold both of those in your hands.
Sure. It is nuanced, certainly. And the last question I'll ask you before we wrap this up is, in terms of consensus building, do you find what is the greatest divide? And I'm going to pose to you a possible answer to my own theory, not knowing.
Say this again?
I'm going to pose to you my own theory.
Yeah, go for it.
And tell me if I'm wrong. Is one of the great divides the politically active and the politically inactive? I mean, the American Jewish community that is particularly active and possibly disproportionately represented in Washington? with the other, or are there greater divides that I may not be thinking of?
I think there's just strong. No, I think the strong divides are on different perceptions of how one should treat Israel as America. So there are those that say no matter what, America should be supportive of any Israeli policy. And then I think there are those who say there should be distinctions made between certain aspects of settlement policy, certainly aspects of pluralism and democracy within the country. And I think it's not a divide by the politically active versus the political. First of all, it's a very active community politically. I mean, American Jews have a huge, voting rate. The percentages are significantly higher than most populations, and I think that the community as a whole just tends to not want public attacks by America or public support of attacks by other countries that America doesn't fight against. And I just will say I don't think it's more than that. I don't think it's politically active. Jews tend to be, the Jewish community. I've seen numbers. I mean, even the Jews that will oppose settlements quite publicly in the polls will also not be excited. Will be supporting Israel in the Gaza war.
Right. Well, Rabbi, thanks for doing this.
Michael, thank you. Thanks a lot.